Hey everybody, I'm Amanda with DevExpress and welcome to today's webinar, Entity Framework and DevExpress ASP.NET, presented by Web Program Manager Mehul and Technical Evangelist Don Wibier. In this webinar, learn how to use DevExpress ASP.NET Web Forms and MVC controls with the Microsoft Entity Framework. We'll start with a short overview of the Entity Framework and dive into a few code samples. All right, thank you so much for joining us. I will now hand things over to Mehul and Don.
Thank you very much, Amanda, and welcome everyone. I'm Mehul, and I'm joined by my colleague Don. Don, how are you doing?
Oh, I'm totally excited to show you some cool code.
Excellent. Well, as we mentioned in a recent webinar, Entity Framework, we recently did a change in the latest DevExpress release, and we thought it was an important subject to present to you the topic of Entity Framework, but specifically in the context of DevExpress ASP.NET controls. So, in today's webinar, I will give you an Entity Framework introduction. So, mostly it's going to be very topical, but then Don is going to jump into a couple of demos, specifically in terms of how to get started with Entity Framework and DevExpress ASP.NET. Then we'll look at LINQ and how you can use the language integrated query, not LINQ to SQL or something like that, but specifically LINQ, and Don will explain the difference, but use that for querying operations. And finally, we'll talk a little bit about the differences in the server-side operations between Entity Framework and DevExpress, DevExpress's own offerings. All right, so first of all, let's get started. Now, Entity Framework, what is it? Well, quite simply, it's just what they call an ORM, an object relational mapper. Entity Framework enables .NET developers to work with relational data using domain-specific objects. So it eliminates the need for most of the data access code that developers usually need to write. Now, it's actively developed by the Entity Framework team at Microsoft in collaboration with the community open source developers. Now, I'll talk a little bit more about that going forward. But in essence, what you can envision it as is, here's your typical model for your application, especially for data access. So you have your application, which generally will talk to your backend. Now, the way it does that is it'll go generally through, let's say, SQL data source or something like that, and that goes to the ADO.NET provider, which then talks to the data store, which could be SQL Server or Oracle or something like that. Now, normally you do that, but what happens is when you introduce an object relational mapper, what you're doing is you're creating a set of objects that represent the tables in your backend, tables and fields in your database. And the reason is you're no longer writing SQL queries to talk to the data store. You're talking to objects. So you're now capable of saying, okay, I want to deal with the objects. Now, I'll talk about some of the benefits and the drawbacks of this, but in essence, yes, you are introducing a level of complexity, but there's also advantages. So this is essentially what an object relational mapper does, and that's what Entity Framework is. And the great thing about this is, you can use this with web forms or MVC. Either approach will work great. And Entity Framework is one of many different ORMs. In fact, DevExpress has its own called Express Persistent Objects. Now, for those of you who have used it, you will find a lot of this familiar. But today's webinar will deal mainly with Entity Framework. All right, let's move on. So, why should you use an ORM? Well, there are various reasons, and I've collected a few from this blog post here, which I'll link to. But in essence, it helps speeding up development by eliminating repetitive code like mapping query results as to object members and vice versa. And it makes data access more abstract and portable. See, ORM implementation classes know how to write vendor-specific SQL, so you don't have to. And it supports object-oriented encapsulation of business rules in your data access layer. You can write and debug business rules in your application language of preference. So instead of writing clunky trigger and store procedure languages. And finally, generating boilerplate code for CRUD operations like create, read, update, or delete. Some ORM frameworks can inspect the database metadata directly or read the metadata mapping files or use declarative class properties. So why would you not use an ORM? Well, I'm simply going to cover this because there is sort of varying opinions on this, and it varies everything from standard how do you say standard users to MVPs. And I believe it kind of boils down to a few reasons. So a lot of times, for simplicity, and you yourself might say this, you might say, well, why would I introduce this complexity of using an ORM if I've got a very simple web app? And I wouldn't disagree with you there. In fact, a lot of times in our demos, you see we don't use an ORM. Well, the main reason is because we're trying to show you something UI related or a specific feature. And so I would recommend, though, that if you have any application of complexity, you should consider using ORM specifically for these reasons. And as something grows, an ORM can really help save those things because you can do things like unit tests much easier and so forth. Now, another issue that has come up is performance. Well, yes, initially Entity Framework in its early stages maybe wasn't as performant, but a lot of those issues have been solved. And nowadays, performance actually can be gained with certain aspects, and Don will talk about that a little bit later on. And finally, security. Well, this is, I think, probably the number one thing. Number one thing. This is one thing that a lot of people were much more concerned with, in that sense, like, well, I'm basically modeling my table and fields directly. I'm no longer going through stored procedures or triggers and so forth. I have to bring that over. So I have to expose my backend completely to my my middle layer, and that's a big concern for many people. In fact, and this is probably the number one reason that most people are not able to use ORM or don't use an ORM, is because the IT or enterprise sort of dictates it that way. Now, there are, for example, Entity Framework and so forth. They are capable of working with stored procedures. So I don't want to discourage you by saying, well, it's not possible. If you have to store procedures, you can work with it in that aspect. However, ORMs work best when you're able to model the data specifically. It's just, probably a few extra hoops you have to jump through to set it up for sort of the other approach. But it is possible to still do that. And I recommend you do take a look at using an ORM. Now, let's take a look at a little bit about Entity Framework. So, how do you get Entity Framework? When the past releases, like version 5, and you can see all of this at this link here, DevExpress ESPR, and I'll highlight it here. But you can see Entity Framework has gone through many iterations. In the early days, it wasn't well received, and then by about version 5, they got a lot of feedback. In version 6, they made a lot of improvements. But really, I think it's not until the current shipping version of 6.1 that they, I think, have solved a lot of the major things that a lot of customers handily gave them feedback for. And Microsoft is so great that they listen to their customers and have improved it quite a bit. And going forward, that they are fixing it even more for version 7, which I'll talk a little bit about more later on. But in essence, version 5 was shipping with Visual Studio 2010 and later with 2012, and version 6 comes with Visual Studio 2013, but even version 6 has some things where now Microsoft is favoring the NuGet package management approach more, and Don will talk about this. In fact, shipping with minor versions of Visual Studio version 6 of Entity Framework, you have to kind of be careful, and that's one of the reasons we wanted to present this webinar for you. And later, I'll talk a little bit about version 7 that's coming out in the Visual Studio 2015 RCs and so forth. And you can see more about the NuGet approach by simply going to NuGet and searching for Entity Framework, and you can find it there on NuGet. So, and all sorts of versions are supported. So you can get the one that they most recently released, or you can even get the version 7 beta. So, now let's talk a little bit about ORM strategy. Now, what this means is when you are modeling your backend and you're creating objects for it, there are 3 approaches you can take on how to do this. And they're labeled as code first, database first, and model first. So in the past, the code first approach simply said, I'm going to create plain old objects and model those for my backend tables and fields. And I believe this is probably the one that is Microsoft has chosen, and what we're going to recommend today as well, because going forward, you can still go with these approaches, but this tends to be in future versions probably the only one supported and so forth. All right, so database first has the idea that says, listen, I have an existing database, create the objects for me. So this is where you'll read the metadata and create the objects for you. Now, there can be some issues. So let's say, for example, the backend tables change. Well, then it could get out of sync, and then you have to use something called migrations and so forth. So there were some challenges with this, and Microsoft has not a lot of work done in this regard in the current version. So if you are interested, you can take a look. Now, the other approach is model first, and this simply said, well, I don't have a database. I'm going to create all my objects first, and then I want Entity Framework to create the database and then update it as I change my model. So you can use one of those approaches. There's a lot to read about them. There's great videos at the Microsoft website you can learn about by simply going to, if you go to ASP.net /Entity Framework, you'll find all sorts of great video under this Getting Started link. Now, sorry, as I mentioned there. So today's approach really is much more about learning ASP.net, the Entity Framework with DevExpress ASP.net. And the reason is we in the 15.1 release did a big change for our demos. Now, in this, if you have the 15.1 release, you'll know that if you go to your users public under public documents, DevExpress demos, components, ASP.net, and you take a look at any one of these demos, you'll find that we have added and changed our demos to use Entity Framework. And we did this for a couple of reasons. So let's say, for example, I'm looking at this ASPX Grid View. You can look at this online. If I'm looking at the grouping data for ASPX Grid View, if you go here to ASPX, and if I look at this in a pop-up window, you'll see that typically the data source ID would say something like SQL data source, but now it's got a custom data source called entity data source. This is the Entity Framework. And here, as Don will show you what these items mean in just a minute, but the reason we did this is because a lot of customers have been asking. They've been moving to Entity Framework. So they said, how do I use DevExpress with ASP.NET? And as as I've said very much in the past, we are very much database-specific agnostic. And we've provided our own Express Persistent Object ORM for many years, and Entity Framework is gaining a lot of steam. They're putting a lot of good changes in it. So we wanted to kind of show you how to do that. And really, if you still want to use SQL data source, that's very easy. That's simply you drag the data source object, SQL data source object from the toolbar, from the toolbox, and drop it and simply point to it. You've seen that in many of our existing demos. But Entity Framework can get a little more complex, as you may want to see. So we've done a lot of work to kind of show you how we ourselves you can use that approach. All right. Now with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague Don. So Don, let's get coding. Let me hand it over to you. What are you going to show us today?
Yeah, Mehul, I'm going to show 3 approaches on how you can get started with the Entity Framework with web forms. If we have some time left, I'll do it for MVC as well, but if you start with any project template with MVC, you'll notice that they are using Entity Framework in it already. So I'm more interested in showing you a couple of features on how to get started with Entity Framework in a web forms application. And before we actually dive into Visual Studio, let me first show you the database that I will be using. The database is the Chinook database, which is available on Codeplex for a number of different database servers. And as you can see, they've got the most common ones scripted. You can just download the scripts for the database you want to use, and we will be using the SQL Server. And even if I go to the documentation page of it, it will have a nice little diagram. And I mean, it's not really important what the diagram is, but in a nutshell, this database holds a number of artists a number of albums with tracks on it, and it's got some customer and invoicing information. For the tests that I will be showing you, I will be primarily interested in the artist table right on the left top of the screen. And you can download this database and play with it yourself and test a number of things with the Entity Framework and stuff like that. So I have already inserted this database in my local SQL server, so I will skip that step, and I will dive into Visual Studio right now. As said, I will show you 3 approaches, and the first one that I'm going to show you is by using the entity data source, which is already used in our demos, like Mehul was mentioning earlier. The next demo I'll show you is the use of our own DevExpress entity server mode data source control. And the last one is the good old object data source, which is available from .NET version 2. And I have put a couple of things behind the items that I'm going to discuss. The first one, the entity data source, will need an update from NuGet, but I'll get to that in like just a couple of minutes. So let's switch over to Visual Studio, and I'm going to start a new application. For that, I will just use my DevExpress template gallery and make sure that I'll be creating an ASP.NET application, and I will go for the empty web application. Just like this. So I have all my references set up correctly, and I can start using DevExpress controls for displaying our entity framework results. Well, as Mehul was mentioning, we need to have an object model which represents the database. So if I switch back to this little diagram, that would mean that I would have to create C# classes, for instance the artist one, that will have a property called artist ID and a property name. And because with Entity Framework and any object relational mapping tool, that is the way that we will be dealing with our data. But the model has quite a bit of tables, so that's quite a bit of work. So fortunately there is a really nice solution for this. I'm going to put all those classes in a separate class library to overcome some reference issues later on. So this will just be a C# class library, and I will also call it dx demo.data. I'll remove this empty class. And well, the thing that I was mentioning is really nice because I can just add a new item, and if I go to the data section, there is this ADO.NET entity data model, and this is exactly what I need. I'll call it a Chinook model, and what you see here in this wizard are the first 3 items, are the items that Mehul was mentioning earlier by using a designer, code first, etc. I will do the code first approach from an existing database, and that will be the code first approach, but it will analyze the database, this wizard will, and it will create a whole bunch of classes for me. So let me quickly connect to the database.
I think that's a nice feature that they just added, in one of the more recent versions, the code first from database, right? Yeah, so it gives you those plain old CLR or class objects.
Yes, this is a very nice feature, which will save you quite some work if you want to start using this on an existing project, for instance. So it's going to set up a connection string as well, and it will now analyze all the entities inside the database, and you'll see here that all the entities which were in the model, so let me switch over to the model, they're basically all in here, and I will be using the artist one I'll still create everything, so you'll have an impression on how this looks. So once I hit finish, it will now start generating some code for me, and it'll take just a couple of seconds. And here we are. So let me first go to the artist one, and what you'll see here is I've got a class which is called artist, and it's decorated with an attribute table which determines for Entity Framework where to persist these classes. And that is just the same if I get the model with it. That is the table artist, and as you can see, it has an artist ID and it's got a name field. And what you see here is we've got an artist ID and we've got a name. And the name is of the type string, so we can decorate that one with a string length attribute, which determines how many characters there should be reserved inside the table in the database. Another interesting thing is this I collection of albums. And if I switch over to the diagram again, then you'll notice that there is a relationship between the artist and the album. Every artist should have at least one, preferably more, albums, and every album will contain one or more tracks. And the relationship is just working with those objects as well. So that's the beauty of ORM. You will be only dealing with C# classes. And if I go to the album class, you'll notice it's got an album ID, it's got a title, it's got an artist ID, but it also has an artist object, which will also be the relationship. This is the one side of the relationship, or basically a reference to the one side. And as you can see, there is a collection with tracks. So this is in a nutshell how these Entity Framework classes are set up. And what you also notice is that these classes are really POCO classes, so they are plain empty classes. They are not derived from anything. So you might wonder, like, how is Entity Framework doing his magic? Well, for that there is one class added, which is the model class. And the model class is derived from an Entity Framework class, and that will do all the magic with, if I want to have a collection of artists, give me that collection, and the DB context will take care of firing up the correct SQL statements, etc. And it will return it in a property which is of the type DB set. And this is basically the magic for Entity Framework. You also notice that there is a Shinu connection string implemented here, and before we can continue on the web application, I need to copy that over because the wizard has put this connection inside my app config of the data library. So let me put it in a connection string of this other one as well, so we don't run into any issues. So what I can now do is I can try to access these Entity Framework objects by building this one, referencing it in my web application by adding it in the references, and I can now add a new page, and that will just be a default page.
And so I like how you can modularize your data access there, Don. You know, so you can have that true data layer now as Entity Framework, and we've done this with our DevAV demo in a similar approach as well. So, but you're dealing now, so that DX demos data really is doing all the middle layer sort of talking, yeah, the ORM specific items.
Yeah. That is pretty convenient, and you'll notice in the last demo that I'll do that we can do some advanced tricks, and we can put it inside this data library as well. Yeah, that's just separation of concerns, etc. And you've got it all in one place, so to say.
Yeah, and you can port it to, let's say, a future. Let's say you now are going to make an MVC one. You can still use that project, right? Because it's not specific to any. I mean, because it's .NET, you can bring it as a reference like you did, right, and use it, let's say, with MVC.
Oh yeah, if you want to port this application over to MVC, then you can just reference this data library, and you've got all your business logic in place, and you can just continue with it. So yeah, that's also the reason that I'm doing this.
Excellent.
So all right, I had set up the default page, so let me put in a grid view. Obviously, it will be a DevExpress one. And I didn't position my cursor correct, so let me move that over to here. And I've got it here. I can now start using the first approach, and the first approach was, if I switch over to the slide deck, the entity data source. So once I switch back, and I'll show you what's going on, why we need this update. If I check out my references in the library, and I will check the version of the entity framework library, then you will notice it will be version 6. If I switch back to my default.aspx and get rid of this one and go to the toolbox and look the data source up, here it is, you will notice that this entity data source is version 4.5, and the entity framework version 6 and this control version 4.5, which is basically based on the entity framework 4.5 as well, they do not work too well with each other. So that's the reason that we need an updated version of this entity data source. But with the appearance of NuGet, that's quite easy to solve. Since I will be using that in the web application, I can just add that package. And let me go to the online source.
And I think that's this is a very important point.
Yeah, this is a very important step, because if you start using the other one, things will just not work.
Yeah, so, because a lot of us, we'll go to the toolbox and we think, oh, entity data source is there. So what happens is, though, that, as Microsoft has updated, that data source in the toolbox is not the latest version, and you need to get the one from NuGet. So please be sure to do this step to get this one from NuGet, because you're not going to be able to get it from the toolbox if you're using the latest version, and it will save you tons of Googling and headaches.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so remember and search for this specific phrase, and then it will be the first control or the first package which will show up in NuGet. And you'll see that this is version 6 as well.
And check that it's created by Microsoft there, because there are some...
There are some others as well, but make sure it's got the purple .NET badge and it's from Microsoft, yeah. But if you search for this particular phrase, then you'll find it as the first one. So let me install this quickly, and it doesn't do a lot of things, but there is one thing that is important. Because that entity data source version 4.5 is registered to the toolbox, it is a bit tricky to have this one registered to the toolbox as well. So if you want to use it, you have to do a bit of manual code for it. Let me do a quick build to see that everything is cool. If I go to the web config, you just saw it actually, that the web config had been changed. And what the package installer actually did is it added one line, which is this one. So we can make use of this control by tag prefixing EF. And what that means is, if I switch over to the markup and I'll go to this place, I can just say EF and it will show up. And this one is the one that we want to be using. I'll call it just entity data source 1. Give it a run at server. We have it on our forum. As I mentioned in the slide, it has some really poor design time support. So if I switch over, you would expect this entity data source, because we need to fill in a number of properties. The first one will be the context type name, and you would expect that you could select it from an editor in this object inspector, but that is not the case. And the same goes in our scenario for the entity set name. You can also not select it, so you have to do that manually. Well, it's not really a big deal, but yeah, it's a bit of a shame. So it's going to be in the namespace dxDemoData, and I can remember the Chinook model. And if I switch over to the properties, then I will need to specify that here. Just like this. Well, we are dealing with the artist, and the artist was a property inside that Chinook model, so I can just specify artist here. This is the property inside that model. Once that is in place, I could specify a number of other things like enable update, enable insert, and enable delete. And I'm going to enable them because the grid supports it. So let me set up the grid now by selecting the entity data source. It also enabled the show edit, show new, and show delete buttons. And you know what? I'm also going to do the search panel. Just like that. And again, because of the poor design time support, there are a number of things that we have to enter manually. And if I go to the data binding, and I will need to specify the key field name, we cannot resolve that from this control design time because of the poor design time support. Not really a big deal, so you can just enter it manually. That will be artist ID. For the rest, we will need to have a number of other things set up. For instance, because it's just a simple thing, I want to have like an inline editing feature. And now we need to set up a number of columns. The command column is already in place. Let me add a text column which will display the artist ID. And that will be bound. Again, that will not be populated, but you need to specify that manually. And let me put on a read-only flag and a column width of 100 pixels. Let me check that one as well, just like this. And I'm going to add another text column which will hold the artist name, and I will give that a width of 500 pixels. Just like this. And to show you that we can do sorting, etc., I'm going to put the sorting index of the ID on 0, and the sort order will be ascending.
I like that new designer.
Yeah, it's excellent. It's really cool. So, did it save everything? Let me do a quick check, because I think okay. Yeah. All right, this is it. So basically there is not much spectacular stuff going on right here. If I now start up my application, you'll notice that it is just like dealing with another data source, like a SQL data source or whatever, and we'll have a list, and we do paging. We'll be able to sort just like it was any other data source. So this is the first thing that I wanted to show you. I can do inline editing as well by making it a bit extra, and it will just work. I can even insert a new one, update it. Let me look it up. There it is, and I'll be able to delete it as well. So this is just almost out of the box stuff. And as you can see, the grid will just work with the entity data source. This brings us to the second sample that I wanted to show you, because there is obviously one thing that you need to be aware of. That is, this table didn't have that much records. And if you have a database which has a huge amount of records, like millions, this will not be the fastest way to go. Because what happens is the entity data source will fetch all the records, make little C# objects out of it, and the grid will take care of the sorting and grouping and stuff. And that will take some time. How much time that actually takes is something that I will be able to show you in a demo that is available on our website. And that is the data binding large database feature. What you'll see here is if I go to another page, we'll measure the time here. And this is with the entity data source, the one that I have been showing you. It'll take, in this case, almost 6 seconds. If I go to another one, again, it'll take like between 6 and 8 seconds. So it's a bit slow and it's not really cool. And this is dealing with 3 million records. And I didn't even do sorting, filtering whatsoever. So this is why we have created the entity server mode data source, which will deal much more efficient with large data sets as the standard one does. And the reason is that we took some code out of our own ORM and created this control from it. So we know how to talk to databases in the most optimum way, and this is what we have created for you. And what you see is that the time for the initial fetch is only 700 milliseconds. And if I switch pages, it takes only 600 milliseconds.
Nice,
so this is
half a second. Now, is that in the toolbox?
Yes, it is in the toolbox.
And is there better design time support for it?
Yeah, there is better design time support. There is also only one thing to be aware of.
Oh, there's a big but. Okay, what is
Not
it?
really a big one, but there is something that you should be aware of, and that is that the updating and inserting and deleting doesn't go as easy as the entity data source. It will need a bit of additional coding, but it's not really a lot. But I mean, this thing is optimized for fetching data out of huge data sets. So
and it does it really well.
Yeah, I'd say so. So, well, let's see how that works. I'll go to the same demo, and I'm gonna open up my toolbox and search again for data source. And what you see here is the entity server mode data source. So let me put it on the form, and we'll start with the good thing, which is the design time support. I can just select my Chinook model, and I can also select my entity, which is the artist in this case. So this is a big pro, I'd say. Excuse me. Let me also enable the delete, insert, and update, because I will show you what is involved. It's really not that much, but you should be aware of it. If I now run this application, you'll see that we need to code in one additional thing, because that is something that we can't always determine, design time. This is the wrong one because I didn't switch over the grid. So let me get the grid switched over to the server mode and run it again. There's one thing that we can't determine in this scenario, design time, which is the key expression, and that's something that we need. So for that, I will need to code in one event with only one simple piece of code, which is the selecting one. The event arguments have a property which is called the key expression, and in this case I will need to specify the name of the property which holds the key.
So this is used for all the sorting, deleting, those operations?
Yeah, more or less, yeah. We need to identify records when paging through the grid and using all those clever selects and stuff. We need the primary key, and in this scenario we can't determine it, so we need to code it by just specifying this one and only piece of code.
Got it.
And well, as you can see, it will just page through the result sets. But again, you won't see a lot of difference because this is a smaller data set. But if this would hold like 1 million artists, it would be even as fast as this one. And well, if we want to do the updating, I'm going to show it to you anyway because it's not that much of code. For that, I will need to go to the design time and bind a couple of other events, which will be for inserting. I'll need to do the inserting event. And let me also bind the other ones, the updating one, and let me also do the deleting one.
So you want to override a few methods? And then...
Yeah, so we're going to put in a couple of lines of code because we need to insert, update, and delete it manually. And we will use a bit of code with link for it. And what we will do is we will first create, with the inserting event, we will create a new artist item in this case. And the values collection of the event arguments will hold the value of the newly entered name, and we'll initialize that item with it. And once we have done that, we can acquire a Chinook context, so a database context, and just add this item. And that's basically also one of the nice things of Entity Framework. We can just add that item to the artist collection, and once we hit the save changes, which is basically a commit, this item will be inserted into the table artists. And because we have done this manually, I can just specify the e.handled equals true, so we have been dealing with this kind of stuff. So this is what you need to do to insert something if you're using the entity server mode data source. For updating, we will need to fetch the item out of the database that we will be updating. So for that, we will need that key value. And again, I will acquire a session or a database context basically. And next, I will find that artist. And again, this find method of the DB set will execute an SQL statement which will fetch the artist with artist ID, which is this. And if we have found it, in other words, the item is not null, then I'll override the properties that I want to change, just like the insert one, but now we're doing it on an existing object. And I'm going to do a save changes. And that's basically it. The last thing looks pretty similar to the previous one, which is the deleting one. For that, I will get the key of the item being deleted. Again, get the database model. Find the artist we're going to delete. And it is just like C# working with collections. I will remove this item from the artist DB set collection. And after I commit it, the item is gone. So this is also something very nice of any object relational mapping tool, because they all work with this kind of approach.
And this is really nice because it gives you, well, first, you're now interacting with those objects, and it gives you a chance to do any last-minute validations before it goes on to the back end, any custom, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily put the custom business rules here, but you have that opportunity to at least.
Yeah. No, I mean, you're absolutely right, but for the demo, I'll show it. There is also two other events that we need to code on the grid, because if we start doing inline editing in the grid, and we have been handling this kind of stuff, we need to tell the grid that it should stop being in edit mode. So for that, I will also assign 2 event handlers on the grid itself, and that can be, that will be, let me find it quickly, the row inserting, and I'll also assign the second one, the row updating. And we need to tell the grid that it should stop editing. And I will make this code a bit generic because I want to do a third demo on the same grid with a different data source. So I will check if we are connected to the entity server mode data source. And if that's the case, I will do a cancel edit. And I will do the same for the updating one. So with this in place, I will have in-place editing on the entity server mode data source as well. And to show you that, I can do just like this. So this is also possible with the entity server mode data source. The last demo that I'd like to show you is still one of my favorite approaches, which is the good old object data source. And what we'll do is I'll show you a bit of link querying with the entity framework classes, so you'll know how to query it in code. And the nice thing of this object data source is that you have total control over the data being processed. So either you're selecting it or updating it or whatever, you have complete control on how fast or how slow it is. And also with this, the grid will work just fine. So let's get back to Visual Studio. And let me drop this object data source on it. Here we are. And for everybody who hasn't been using this object data source before, it needs to be attached to a class which implements all the business logic. So you will have a very nice separation of business logic versus UI, etc. And you can do this by choose your business object. And let me show only the data components. There isn't any, and that is because we have to code that. Well, I've set up a couple of preparations for it, so I can be, let me cancel this one. Let me switch over to my data project and add a new class for it. I will call it the artist data source. And I've also set up a little CodeRush template which shows you what is involved in getting this up and running. So let me execute this template. And this is the business object class, and I will just call it artist data source. I will be dealing with artist objects, and I've even put in some comments for validation and stuff. So this is what you were just mentioning, Mehul. I'll do all the validation right here. So this is a better place basically to do that. And once I have finished my template, I can start coding. As you can see, these methods are decorated with a data object method. And this one is a select. I've got an insert, I've got an update, and I've got a delete method. And what I can do here is basically whatever I like. So for instance, if I want to select everything from the artists, I can just specify it by saying, let me get rid of that. And for this, I will have to assign or create a database context again, and let me do that as a private member.
And that's because this object is kind of like a bridge, right? Because the other artist class is already deriving from DB context, we don't have to. But in this case, we're saying, hey, we're using just a plain old object data source. Let me just connect it up to the object data source. And if we're making a plain old object that has no context, we have to give it that context that says, hey, this is how you connect to it, and then, you know, that context that you just gave it is the one that's actually going to create the SQL queries and so forth, right?
Yeah, exactly. And now I've got this context created because this class will be there will be an instance being created at runtime once a data bind occurs. So that's why I can just put that model as private. I could make it private read-only actually. But now I can do some querying like from and in context dot artist select n, for instance. So this will give me a query like select everything from artist. And I can now return this result.
You know, while you're typing that down, just to share a quick story about that. So you'll see most link queries where you're doing a select, it starts from instead of select. So it sort of flips around select and from.
Yeah.
And you know, Anders Halsberg, who was creating link, they asked him one time, well, why did you do that? And he says, listen, you know, we don't know what to select from. So you have to give it the context of, you know, select from this, then I can go select those items. So I know what's available if I know where it's coming from first. So once I finally heard him say that, that made a lot more sense of why we start with from and then select afterwards, so that you have
exactly
where it's coming from. Because, you know, in the object sense, so because, you know, SQL Query Analyzer is not really checking that. I mean, nowadays it's a lot better, but this is actually doing some validation.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And at first it may seem a bit strange, but once you know how it works, you can do so many cool things with this. So anyway, I have done a simple query, and it will just fetch everything and it will return it. And I will leave the insert and the updates for what it is right now, because if I switch over back to my default, and I should build this one, I should now be able to fetch my newly created business object. And here it is. And I'll also be able to select my select method. And that will be the one that I've just been coding. And I could also select the update, the insert, and the delete ones. They will raise an exception because it was not implemented yet, but I mean, I can just specify them anyway.
You can use the similar code that you did for the other events.
Yeah, pretty much. Yeah. I'll put it in. I'll just paste it in so you'll have an impression on how that works. But I mean, I'll go over it pretty fast. So let me just put it in there, because what I can do here is basically the same. You know what?
That's okay. I mean, we'll put this source up on GitHub as usual, and Don will write a blog post with all the links, all the good stuff.
Yep, exactly. So once I have built the application, I should change over the grid, obviously, to another data source. No, I don't want to delete everything. And I can now run the same demo with the object data source.
Man, that's a versatile grid, isn't it?
It is a really cool grid, man. It's awesome. And I mean, I haven't done anything for like my good old Aerosmith is just popping up while filtering on the correct characters. And I haven't done any coding for that. That's just grid behavior, which is awesome. So as you can see, basically, this is all working pretty out of the box. And I do have to mention, with the example of the object data source, that this is not the most optimum way that the data source will select stuff. And I was mentioning you have fine-grained control over what stuff to get. And you can use that approach by configuring a number of properties. And I'm just going to show that to you really fast, but I will not be running the demo because we are running a bit out of time otherwise. You can specify a select method, and let me paste in one piece of code, and I will not code it, I will not implement it, but I'll put it on GitHub anyway. I can put in a second select method, and this is actually where the fun begins, because I can specify a method with the following signature. And what you can do here, if I also make this a select decorated one, you'll see a search text, a sort expression, and these start row index and maximum rows are basically things that can be specified as a property, what you see here. And once we switch over the grid to data source force standard paging, in that case, the grid will tell the object data source how many rows to fetch and which rows to skip. And in that case, you can get your own paged result sets out of the database yourself. And with LINQ, that is pretty easy. And yeah, that is the last thing that I wanted to show you about the object data source and the power of the object data source, basically.
Thanks, Don. You know, we're running a little low on time, so let's let me switch over. Really great stuff that you showed there. I appreciate it. And I think that's an important point about the data source paging thing that you mentioned there. We have lots of DevExpress support staff who have answered questions about that, because a lot of customers are using some really great approaches for ORMs, and custom ORMs where they use object data source, and they said, I want full control of that paging and sorting, so you have options for that, or entity framework. Now, we didn't have a whole lot of questions. Most have been answered already. So let me just wrap this up by saying again, we made a big shift in 15.1 to show the demos for Entity Framework. And we chose Entity Framework mostly because, Microsoft technologies, whenever Microsoft, releases something, the .NET world is going to obviously pay attention to it. So our customer base has had a lot of questions about it. And we simply wanted to show we're very agnostic to data. We're focused on UI. And even though we have our own ORM framework that's been around longer, that's really great as well. So if you want to check it out, go to devexpress.com/xpo. Has some great benefits in it as well. And you saw, as Don showed, that it's getting started is pretty easy. The end result may look the same. You say, hey, the grid looks the same and it works the same. It's still beautiful. Well, that's right. The UI is not going to change, but it's the middle layer as a developer that you have now control and power over. So. With that, I just want to say, well, before I say thanks, let me talk about the future real quick of NuGet. I'm sorry, of Entity Framework. And as Entity Framework 7 is being developed, it's changed quite a bit. So it's being, first of all, developed in a very open source way, as is most of the new ASP.NET items. And as well, they're making some key decisions. For example, you can see here that they're going with, let's say, a very code-first approach. And it's something to keep an eye on. So if you want, still just go to the if you go to github.com/ASP.NET Entity Framework, you can even take a look exactly the new items they're putting in. They've done a bunch of videos about this at the Build conference and so forth. And if you're just like, hey, listen, I'm just gonna wait until Visual Studio 2015 is out or Entity Framework 7 is officially released. That's fine. Once it's released, we'll support it as well. For now, we're supporting all the shipped versions. So with that, thank you very much for joining today. We hope you find it useful. If you have any questions, let us know at devexpress.com/support. You can reach Don on Twitter or his email, or myself as well. Don will be putting up a blog post with links to that projects and source code that he showed, or take a look at those DevExpress demos, which are also online. Mandel, thank you very much.
Awesome. All right, everybody. If you missed them live, all of our 15.1 launch webinars are posted and ready to watch on our YouTube channel. You can also find them at devexpress.com/webinars, along with all of our upcoming webinars in July. We've got Enterprise-Ready Apps with DevExtreme Mobile coming July 14th, and How to Create an Office 365 Clone, July 21st, again with Mehul and Don, so you can register for those now. Again, today's webinar will be available later on our DevExpress YouTube channel. The link is posted in the chat box. And that is it for this one. Thanks to Mehul and Don. Thank you all for joining us. And of course, thank you for choosing DevExpress. Bye-bye.